The fluorescent lights of Mass General Hospital hummed with an indifferent, icy chill. I am Audrey, 23 years old, a medical intern. I once thought family was a pillar of support. I was wrong. At 5 a.m., the beeping of the heart monitor became the soundtrack to a betrayal. Clarissa leaned over, tucked the blanket back around Mom, who was still frail after her hip surgery, and fed her a sweet lie. She promised she was just going to the counter to sign some paperwork. Then she'd circle the car back to pick Mom up right away. I stood behind the glass door, frozen. I saw Clarissa and her husband exchange a sharp, calculating glance, not a hint of hesitation. They walked away quickly, heading down the hallway toward the emergency exit. They didn't look back once at the woman who had given them everything. My mother just sat there, patient, eyes fixed on the elevator doors. Her trembling hands clutched her small bag of clothes tightly. An hour passed. The hospital shifted to the next shift. Everything grew noisy, but Mom remained there like a ghost in the vast hallway, small, silent, and abandoned. From the window, I watched their luxury SUV speed out onto the main road and vanish into the Boston fog. A heavy lead weight pressed down on my chest. They weren't coming back. This wasn't a mistake. This was a calculated execution. A lethal blow planned in advance to strip away a mother's home dignity and very breath in a single moment. Image of an elderly mother sitting alone in a wheelchair in the long, empty hospital corridor. If you believe parents are not disposable trash to be thrown away by the very children they raised, please hit subscribe. Your support helps me seek justice. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think about this. Living in the shadow of historical brownstones in Boston required a certain level of financial endurance that my meager medical intern stipend could barely support. I spent my days navigating the sterile, high-pressure corridors of the hospital while wearing worn-out sneakers and carrying a lunch bag filled with simple sandwiches to save every possible cent. My mother, Martha, often looked at my exhausted face with a mixture of pride and pity whenever I visited her small but elegant apartment tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. She would offer me tea while listening to my stories about clinical rotations because she truly valued the nobility of the medical profession despite our tightening budget. Everything felt relatively stable until my older sister Clarissa decided to sweep into the living room like a hurricane draped in expensive silk and smelling of overpriced perfume. She had built a reputation as a fierce real estate mogul who could sell a haunted shack for millions, but her flashy exterior was starting to show some desperate cracks lately. Clarissa often leaned against the mahogany bookshelf while glancing at her gold watch, as if my presence were a minor inconvenience in her busy schedule of closing predatory deals. She never missed an opportunity to remind me that my late nights at the hospital would never earn me the kind of lifestyle she displayed so ostentatiously. According to her narrow worldview, a medical degree was just an expensive piece of paper that failed to produce immediate cold hard cash for the family estate. Mom always tried to maintain peace by praising the extravagant gifts that Clarissa brought over, like imported chocolates or designer scarves that eventually sat unused in the closet. My mother believed these expensive gestures were signs of genuine success because she wanted to believe her eldest daughter was flourishing in the competitive Boston market. I watched quietly as Clarissa whispered about new investment opportunities while showing Mom glossy brochures of luxury retirement villas that seemed far too good to be true. It was painful to see how easily Mom was swayed by the promise of a golden future that relied entirely on Clarissa's supposedly superior financial wisdom. The fragile piece of our family dynamic shattered completely on a Tuesday evening when a frantic phone call informed me that Mom had suffered a terrible fall down the steep wooden stairs of her home. I rushed to the emergency room with my heart pounding against my ribs while praying that her injuries were not as severe as the initial report suggested. The orthopedic surgeon confirmed that she had shattered her hip and would require immediate surgery followed by an extensive and very expensive period of rehabilitation. This medical crisis acted like a catalyst that drew the vultures out of the shadows to circle our family's modest legacy with sharpened claws. My brother-in-law Jeffrey appeared at the hospital shortly after the surgery with a leather briefcase tucked under his arm and a fake smile plastered across his face. I had never liked Jeffrey because he possessed a slimy charisma that felt like a cheap veneer over a very greedy soul. He immediately began questioning the nurses about the insurance coverage and the total value of Mom's property assets instead of asking about her pain levels or recovery time. Clarissa stood beside him while nodding in agreement, as Jeffrey suggested that he should take over the management of Mom's bank accounts to simplify the upcoming medical payments. Their sudden interest in her finances felt incredibly aggressive and far too coordinated for a couple who rarely visited her when she was healthy. I escaped the suffocating atmosphere of the waiting room to find a quiet corner in the hospital cafeteria where the fluorescent lights felt slightly less oppressive than my relatives' presence. My best friend Marcus, who was also a medical intern, noticed my distressed expression and sat down across from me with 2 cups of bitter black coffee. He had been observing Mom's charts during his shift and leaned in close to speak in a hushed tone that carried the weight of professional concern. Marcus warned me that Mom's recovery would be complicated by her underlying blood pressure issues, which made the high doses of painkillers she was receiving quite risky. He pointed out that her sudden bouts of confusion were not just a result of the trauma, but could be exacerbated by the medication Jeffrey was pushing the doctors to administer. We sat there in silence for a moment as the gravity of the situation began to settle into my weary bones like a cold winter chill. Marcus gripped my hand briefly while reminding me that I was the only one in the family who actually understood the clinical reality of Mom's condition. I realized then that Clarissa and Jeffrey were not just being overbearing, but were actively maneuvering to keep Mom in a state of vulnerable dependence. My medical training had taught me how to diagnose physical ailments, but it had not prepared me for the toxic greed infecting my own flesh and blood. Every decision I made from that point forward had to be calculated with the same precision I used during a delicate surgical procedure. 15 days before the ruthless greed of Clarissa finally tore our family apart, I began to notice several disturbing patterns that suggested a much darker agenda was in play. Every time I stepped into the recovery ward during my breaks, the air felt thick with a synthetic calm that did not belong in a place of healing. I checked the medication administration record on the digital monitor and felt my heart sink when I saw the increased dosages of heavy sedatives. Clarissa had been persistently leaning on the night shift nurses to administer extra painkillers under the guise of managing my mother's perceived discomfort. My mother, Martha, spent most of her afternoons drifting in a state of semi-consciousness, with her eyes glazed over as if she were trapped behind a thick veil of fog. She could barely recognize my voice when I whispered her name, yet Clarissa insisted that this was merely a natural part of the post-surgical recovery process for a woman of her age. One afternoon, I arrived earlier than usual and caught Jeffrey standing by the bedside with a stack of legal documents and a portable ink pad. He was holding Mom's limp hand and guiding her thumb toward a signature line on a deed transfer document, while she mumbled incoherently about needing a glass of water. I dropped my clipboard in shock as the realization hit me that they were physically forcing a confused woman to surrender her lifelong assets. Jeffrey jumped back with a guilty start while quickly shoving the papers into his briefcase before I could read the fine print of the contract. He tried to brush past me with a smirk, but I blocked his path and demanded to know why a legal transaction was happening in a high-dependency medical unit. The confrontation quickly escalated into a heated argument when Clarissa entered the room and placed herself firmly between me and our mother. She accused me of being paranoid and argued that someone had to make executive decisions regarding the family property while Mom was incapacitated. I reminded her that Mom was not legally competent to sign anything while under the influence of the narcotics that she had requested from the doctors. Clarissa laughed coldly and told me that my medical student status did not give me the authority to dictate how she managed the family's long-term security. She made it very clear that I was merely an observer in this process, while she was the one bearing the financial burden of the private room and the specialized nursing staff. The atmosphere in the hospital room became increasingly hostile as Clarissa and Jeffrey began to implement a strict isolation policy that limited Mom's outside contact. They told the front desk staff that Mom was too exhausted for visitors and specifically requested that my access be restricted outside of official visiting hours. I felt like a stranger in my own life as I watched them filter every piece of information that reached my mother's ears during her brief moments of lucidity. They whispered about rising debts and the supposed necessity of selling the Boston home to pay for a fictional luxury care facility in another state. Mom would simply nod with a vacant expression while clutching the bedsheets, because she no longer had the mental strength to question the lies they were weaving. Determined to find a way to protect her, I began to secretly duplicate the relevant sections of her medical file whenever the nursing station was distracted by the shift change. I knew that having a physical record of the excessive sedation would be crucial if I ever had to challenge the validity of those signed documents in a court of law. My hands were shaking as I tucked the photocopied pages under my white coat and hurried toward the staff locker room to hide them in my backpack. Every page I scanned revealed a systematic pattern of requests from Clarissa that deliberately kept Mom in a state of chemical submission for nearly 2 weeks. Late that evening, I met Marcus near the darkened parking garage where he handed me a printout showing several suspicious inquiries into Mom's joint savings account. He warned me that Clarissa was trying to liquidate the remaining cash reserves by claiming that the funds were needed for urgent medical supplies that the insurance would not cover. Marcus had noticed that the signatures on the withdrawal slips were barely legible scrawls that looked nothing like my mother's elegant handwriting from just a month ago. We stood in the shadows of the concrete pillars while discussing the terrifying possibility that they were planning to leave Mom with absolutely nothing once the house was sold. The clinical world I had once respected now felt like a prison, where my own sister was the warden and my mother was the unsuspecting captive. I realized that the woman I grew up with had been replaced by a predator who viewed her own mother as nothing more than a final payout to cover her failing investments. My only hope was to keep gathering evidence in silence while waiting for the right moment to intervene before they could complete their final act of betrayal. The hospital corridors grew eerily quiet as the clock ticked toward midnight, marking the final 8 hours before my mother would be officially discharged into a world that no longer contained her home. I sat in the dim light of the nurse's station while reviewing patient charts, but my mind was consumed by the stolen medical records hidden inside my locker. Clarissa spent the evening sitting by the bed and painting a vivid, fraudulent picture of a sun-drenched penthouse in Florida where private nurses would cater to my mother's every whim. She described the ocean breeze and the luxury amenities with such conviction that even the seasoned hospital staff seemed impressed by her apparent generosity. Mom listened to these elaborate stories with a hopeful smile because she desperately needed to believe that her final years would be spent in comfort surrounded by her family. It was agonizing to watch her fragile happiness when I knew that every word coming out of Clarissa's mouth was a calculated deception designed to keep Mom compliant. During a brief moment when I went to fetch a glass of water, I caught Clarissa standing near the emergency exit while speaking in a hushed, urgent tone into her smartphone. She was finalizing the details with a real estate broker and confirmed that the keys to Mom's historical Boston home would be handed over to the new owners by noon tomorrow. I pressed my back against the cold tile wall while listening to her cold instructions regarding the immediate removal of all remaining personal effects from the property. There was no mention of a retirement facility in Florida or a specialized nursing team because the entire conversation revolved around the final settlement of the sales commission. Clarissa sounded like a different person as she laughed about how easily they had secured the power of attorney during Mom's most confused moments. My hands trembled so violently that the water splashed onto the floor, but I forced myself to remain silent to avoid revealing my position in the shadows. While Clarissa managed the legal theft from the hospital, Jeffrey was busy at the house erasing the physical evidence of our family's long and cherished history. He had spent the last several hours clearing out the attic and tossing my late father's personal belongings into large black plastic bags destined for the local landfill. I had received a frantic text from a neighbor who saw the moving van parked in the driveway during the middle of the night. Jeffrey didn't care about the sentimental value of my father's old books or the hand-carved furniture that had been in our family for 3 generations. Everything was treated as mere clutter that stood in the way of a quick transaction and a hefty payout for his failing business ventures. The thought of those precious memories being discarded like common trash felt like a physical blow to my chest that left me struggling for breath. The most chilling moment occurred when I witnessed a whispered conference between Clarissa and Jeffrey in the hospital cafeteria, just before the sun began to rise. They sat huddled over a cold breakfast while discussing the logistical nightmare of what to do with a woman who still required significant medical assistance. Clarissa argued that bringing Mom back to their own villa would disrupt their social schedule and potentially lower the resale value of their property if medical equipment were installed. Jeffrey agreed and suggested that leaving her at the hospital entrance would be the most efficient way to wash their hands of the entire situation. They reached a horrifying consensus to abandon her in the lobby after pretending to go and retrieve the car from the parking garage. This was the exact moment I realized that I was no longer dealing with family members, but with cold-blooded predators who had no intention of fulfilling their moral obligations. I knew that I could not afford to waste a single second on tears or useless confrontations while the clock was still working in my favor. I quietly slipped out to the staff parking lot and began transforming my old sedan into a makeshift sanctuary for the long journey that lay ahead. I packed a suitcase with Mom's most comfortable clothes and gathered all the necessary medical supplies that Marcus had managed to help me acquire. I double-checked the stash of painkillers and surgical dressings because I knew that we would be on the road for several days without access to a pharmacy. My backpack was heavy with the incriminating medical records and the evidence of their financial fraud that I intended to use when the time was right. Every movement I made was deliberate and careful as I prepared for a desperate escape that would take us thousands of miles away from the reach of Clarissa's influence. The early morning light began to bleed through the gray Boston clouds as I returned to the ward to find Mom already dressed and waiting in her wheelchair. She looked so small and vulnerable in the vastness of the hospital room that my heart ached with a mixture of fierce protection and overwhelming sorrow. Clarissa was busy applying a fresh coat of lipstick while checking her reflection in the mirror, as if she were preparing for a celebratory social event rather than an act of betrayal. I stood in the doorway and watched them with a clinical detachment because I had already committed myself to a path that left no room for hesitation or fear. The next few hours would determine whether my mother would spend her remaining days in a cold institution or find safety in the wilderness of Montana. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room with a calm expression while hiding the true extent of my preparations beneath the professional veneer of a medical student. By exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the harsh Boston sun began to beat down on the pavement as Clarissa prepared to execute the final stage of her cruel deception. I watched from a distance as she leaned down to kiss Mom on the cheek, before whispering that she just needed to bring the SUV around to the front entrance. Mom sat huddled in her wheelchair with a blanket draped over her shivering legs, while watching the automatic doors slide shut behind her departing eldest daughter. Suddenly, my medical instincts screamed at me because I noticed the rapid fluttering of Mom's eyelids and the way her hands began to twitch uncontrollably. She was suffering from an acute adverse reaction to the heavy sedatives that Clarissa had insisted on doubling just an hour prior to discharge. I lunged forward across the lobby floor and reached Mom just as her head began to loll backward in a terrifying display of chemical distress. The surrounding nursing staff froze in a moment of indecision, but my training took over with a fierce and desperate clarity that pushed aside my fear. I immediately tilted Mom's head back to clear her airway while calling out for a crash cart and a dose of Narcan to counteract the narcotics flooding her system. My hands were steady as I checked her thundering pulse while barking orders to the nearby orderlies, who were still confused by the sudden chaos. I managed to stabilize her breathing and revive her consciousness through sheer force of will before the emergency team could even arrive on the scene. The nurses looked at me with newfound respect because they realized that I had just saved my mother's life from a fatal overdose that they had unknowingly administered. Mom gripped my forearm with a strength born of pure terror as she gasped for air and looked around the lobby for the daughter who had just left her to die. Without waiting for permission, I grabbed the handles of the wheelchair and began pushing Mom toward the west parking lot exit with a grim determination. I spotted the familiar black luxury SUV idling near the gate and realized that Jeffrey was already shifting the gear into drive to make their clean getaway. I sprinted ahead and positioned my body directly in front of their bumper while staring through the windshield with an intensity that forced him to slam on the brakes. Jeffrey rolled down the window and began shouting profanities while telling me to get out of the way before he ran me over in broad daylight. Clarissa climbed out of the passenger side with her designer bag clutched tightly to her chest, while her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. The professional facade she had maintained for weeks finally crumbled as she screamed that the Boston house was already sold and the money was legally hers. Clarissa stepped closer until I could smell the expensive coffee on her breath, while she declared that Mom was nothing more than an expensive, useless burden. She told me that if I wanted to play the role of the savior, then I could deal with the consequences of caring for a broken old woman with no assets left. Jeffrey stepped out of the vehicle and attempted to lunge forward to snatch the backpack containing the incriminating medical records from my shoulders. He was much larger than me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate greed that made him capable of any act of violence in that moment. Fortunately, Marcus emerged from the hospital side entrance and stepped firmly between me and Jeffrey before the situation could turn into a physical assault. Marcus held his ground with a calm but menacing posture that made Jeffrey hesitate and eventually retreat back toward the safety of his luxury car. My friend looked back at me and nodded toward the old sedan that I had prepared earlier, while he continued to block Jeffrey's path with his broad shoulders. I didn't waste another second on words because the truth had already been laid bare for everyone in the parking lot to witness. I reached down and lifted Mom's frail body into my arms with a surge of adrenaline that made her feel as light as a feather against my chest. Mom was crying softly against my neck while she whispered about her lost jewelry and the photos of my father that Jeffrey had presumably destroyed during the night. I carefully settled her into the passenger seat of my car and buckled her in while Clarissa continued to scream insults from across the asphalt. I turned around one final time to look at the sister I had once looked up to and told her that she would never see either of us again as long as I was breathing. The crowd of patients and staff that had gathered near the entrance watched in stunned silence as the drama of our family's collapse reached its peak. I got behind the steering wheel and started the engine while Marcus gave me a final thumb up to signal that he would handle the aftermath at the hospital. As I pulled out onto the main road, I saw Clarissa and Jeffrey arguing in the rearview mirror, like two vultures fighting over the scraps of a life they had successfully picked clean. My hands were finally steady on the wheel as the Boston skyline began to fade into the distance behind us, marking the start of our uncertain journey. The humming of the tires against the asphalt became the only constant in a world that had suddenly turned upside down as we left the Boston skyline far behind. For the next 48 hours, my life became a breathless race toward freedom, while the car's interior felt increasingly small under the weight of Clarissa's relentless telephonic threats. Every time my phone vibrated on the dashboard, I felt a jolt of pure adrenaline because I knew her voice would be filled with the poisonous desperation of a cornered predator. She screamed about filing kidnapping charges and promised that the state police would be waiting for us at every toll booth along the interstate. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon while navigating through the dense traffic of Massachusetts and eventually crossing the borders of the next three states toward the rugged wilderness of Montana. By the second day of our journey, the chemical fog finally began to lift from my mother's mind as the effects of the excessive hospital sedation started to wear off completely. Martha sat upright in the passenger seat with a newfound clarity that made her eyes appear sharper than I had seen them in weeks. I decided that she deserved the absolute truth, regardless of how much it might hurt her fragile heart in the moment. I slowly explained how Clarissa and Jeffrey had orchestrated the sale of her beloved historical home while she was incapacitated in the recovery ward. Mom listened in stunned silence as I described the black plastic bags filled with my father's belongings and the fraudulent penthouse in Florida that never truly existed. She began to sob with a deep guttural sorrow that echoed through the quiet cabin of the car as she realized her own children had treated her like a disposable asset. In the middle of a lonely stretch of highway, I decided to place a call to my Aunt Sarah, who was a fiercely independent woman living on a sprawling horse ranch in Bozeman. I hadn't spoken to her in years due to the family rift that Clarissa had carefully manufactured to keep us isolated from our more protective relatives. Sarah picked up on the third ring and listened to my frantic explanation without interrupting a single time as I described our desperate situation. Her voice was steady and filled with a rugged authority that immediately provided the emotional anchor I so desperately needed. She told us that her gates were open and that no one, not even the Boston police, would be able to take Martha away once we reached the safety of the Montana mountains. This conversation provided a glimmer of hope that kept my hands steady on the steering wheel, despite the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm my senses. The fear of being intercepted by law enforcement remained a constant shadow because Clarissa continued to send messages claiming she had already contacted the authorities. I frequently checked the rearview mirror for any sign of flashing lights while maintaining a speed that wouldn't attract unnecessary attention from highway patrol. Every gas station stop felt like a high-stakes gamble as I tried to keep Mom's face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat while we refueled and grabbed supplies. I realized that as long as Mom was carrying her old smartphone, Clarissa could potentially use the internal tracking software to pinpoint our exact location. When I explained this risk to Mom during a brief stop near a bridge overlooking a churning river, she showed a level of resilience that genuinely surprised me. Without saying a word, she stepped out of the car and hurled her expensive device into the dark waters below with a defiant strength that signaled her final break from Clarissa's control. We spent the remaining hours of the night sharing deep, honest conversations at quiet rest stops, where the air smelled of pine needles and damp earth instead of sterile hospital hallways. Mom talked about her early years with my father and her regret for allowing herself to be blinded by Clarissa's manipulative charms for so long. She apologized for not seeing the quiet strength I had inherited from my father while she was busy being dazzled by the flashy success of her eldest daughter. I told her that we were starting a new chapter where her dignity would never again be sacrificed for someone else's financial gain or social status. These moments of raw vulnerability forged a new bond between us that was far stronger than the superficial family ties we had left behind in the city. As we crossed the final state line into the vast openness of the Big Sky country, the oppressive weight of the past few weeks began to lift slightly from my shoulders. The towering peaks of the mountains rose up to meet us like ancient guardians who promised to shield us from the vultures circling back in Boston. I knew that Clarissa would not give up easily, but she was now hundreds of miles away in a world that was becoming increasingly irrelevant to our survival. We were no longer victims fleeing a crime scene, but two survivors reclaiming their right to live on their own terms. I looked over at Mom and saw her watching the sunrise over the plains with a faint, determined smile that told me she was finally ready to fight for her future. The road ahead was still long and filled with legal challenges, yet for the first time in my life, I felt that we were driving toward a home that truly belonged to us. The crisp mountain air of Bozeman had a healing quality that no hospital in Boston could ever replicate during our first 90 days in Montana. 3 months of living beneath the towering shadows of the peaks had transformed my mother from a fragile victim into a woman with iron in her spirit once again. Martha spent her mornings on the porch of the ranch while breathing in the scent of pine and watching the horses graze in the distance. Her physical recovery was nothing short of miraculous, thanks to a rigorous physical therapy routine designed specifically by Sarah. My aunt understood that healing the body required more than just medicine because it demanded a connection to the earth and a sense of purpose. Sarah encouraged Mom to walk slightly further each day across the uneven terrain until her shattered hip regained its former strength and stability. I watched them from the kitchen window while feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the sanctuary this ranch had provided for us. While Mom focused on regaining her physical strength, I balanced my time between working at the local medical clinic and building a legal fortress. I spent my afternoons collaborating with a professional attorney named Mr. Henderson, who specialized in elder financial abuse and property fraud cases. We spent countless hours reviewing the photocopied medical records I had smuggled out of the hospital to prove that Mom was chemically incapacitated when she signed those deeds. Mr. Henderson was a methodical man with a sharp mind who promised me that the law would eventually catch up with the predators back in Massachusetts. He helped me organize the evidence into a comprehensive timeline that highlighted every instance of Clarissa's manipulation and Jeffrey's aggressive financial interference. Our case was becoming stronger with every piece of paper we filed with the court system in Boston. The investigation took a significant turn when a private detective hired by Mr. Henderson began digging into the dark corners of Jeffrey's professional life. We discovered that he had accumulated massive gambling debts at several high-stakes casinos across the New England area over the past 2 years. His desperate need for liquid cash was the true motivation behind the hurried sale of Mom's historical home and the attempted liquidation of her savings. Jeffrey had been using our family's legacy to pay off ruthless creditors who were threatening to dismantle his own failing business empire. This revelation provided the missing piece of the puzzle and solidified our claim that the house sale was a result of criminal coercion rather than a family necessity. It was a sickening reality to confront, but it gave us the legal ammunition we needed to move forward with a formal lawsuit. As the legal pressure began to mount back in Boston, Clarissa started sending a series of desperate and transparently fraudulent apology letters to the ranch. She claimed that she had only acted out of concern for Mom's long-term health and pleaded for a chance to explain her side of the story in person. These letters arrived almost daily because her business partners were starting to turn their backs on her, following the rumors of our legal battle. Her creditors were now pursuing her with the same ruthlessness she had shown toward her own mother just a few months ago. Clarissa's world was crumbling around her, and she was desperately searching for a way to manipulate her way back into Mom's good graces to save herself from bankruptcy. I made sure to intercept these letters and keep them as additional evidence of her manipulative behavior for Mr. Henderson to review. Mom eventually sat down at the heavy oak dining table one evening and requested to see the full extent of the evidence we had gathered against her eldest daughter. She read through the detective's report on Jeffrey's gambling and examined the records of her own sedation with a cold and steady gaze. Without shedding a single tear, she reached for the legal documents that Mr. Henderson had prepared for her signature earlier that week. Mom decisively signed the paperwork to formally disinherit Clarissa and revoke every power of attorney that had been fraudulently obtained during her hospital stay. She looked at me with a profound clarity and stated that she no longer had a daughter named Clarissa because that person had died the moment she sold her mother's dignity. This act of finality was the ultimate turning point in our journey toward total independence and psychological healing. The following week brought another wave of positive change when I received a formal offer for a permanent position as a physician's assistant at the regional hospital. The medical director had been impressed by my dedication at the clinic and offered me a salary that would allow us to build a sustainable life here in Montana. This opportunity meant that we would no longer be dependent on Sarah's generosity and could eventually look for a small home of our own near the mountains. The future that had once seemed so bleak and uncertain was now filled with the promise of stability and professional growth in a community that valued our presence. I felt a tremendous weight lift from my heart as I realized that the cycle of poverty and fear that Clarissa had tried to impose on us was finally broken. We celebrated that evening with a small dinner on the porch, while the sun set in a brilliant display of orange and purple over the Bozeman horizon. Mom laughed for the first time in months while she talked about planting a small garden of her own when the spring arrived. Sarah raised a glass to our resilience and reminded us that the mountains had a way of testing people before giving them their greatest rewards. I realized then that the betrayal we suffered had not destroyed us, but had instead cleared away the toxic weeds to allow a much stronger version of our family to grow. Our battle with Clarissa was far from over in the courtroom, but our spirits were already victorious and free from her reach. The quiet peace of the Montana night felt like a sacred blessing after the chaotic storm we had navigated together. The quiet anticipation of our new life reached a definitive climax on the morning of the final virtual court hearing regarding the financial crimes committed against my mother. I sat next to Mom in Sarah's sunlit study while looking at the digital display that connected our Montana sanctuary to a cold courtroom in Boston. Clarissa appeared on the screen with sunken eyes and a hollow expression that radiated a deep, festering resentment toward everyone involved in the proceedings. Her signature designer suits had been replaced by a drab, dark outfit that made her look older and much more desperate than I remembered from our last confrontation. The legal hammer finally fell when the judge reviewed the overwhelming evidence of her systemic manipulation and the fraudulent transfer of property deeds. Clarissa watched in stunned silence as the court officially revoked her professional real estate brokerage license for life, while imposing a massive financial penalty that would effectively bankrupt her remaining business interests. While Clarissa was reeling from the loss of her professional status, the screen flickered to show the ongoing developments involving Jeffrey's separate criminal investigation. He had been apprehended by the police at their suburban residence just hours before the hearing started, due to his involvement in an extensive money laundering ring. The authorities had uncovered evidence that Jeffrey used his real estate connections to facilitate tax evasion for high-stakes gambling syndicates throughout the New England area. He looked pathetic and disheveled as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists in front of the neighbors who had once admired his outward display of wealth. This arrest was the final nail in the coffin of their shared greed, because it proved that their betrayal of Mom was merely a small part of a much larger criminal enterprise. I felt a strange sense of detachment while watching his downfall, because the man who had once tried to intimidate me was now reduced to a common criminal, facing years of incarceration. The atmosphere in the virtual courtroom shifted to a solemn tone when the judge invited my mother to deliver her final statement regarding the future of her estate. Mom adjusted her glasses and looked directly into the camera lens with a dignified strength that made my heart swell with pride. She spoke with a clear, resonant voice that left no room for ambiguity as she addressed the court and the daughter who had betrayed her trust. Martha Dong Dak Kong Jin, that Audrey was the only child she recognized as her family and the sole person she trusted to manage her remaining assets and healthcare decisions. She officially transferred all power of attorney to me while making it legally impossible for Clarissa to ever interfere with our lives or finances again. The judge nodded in agreement and formalized the decree, while Clarissa buried her face in her hands to hide the tears of anger that were finally starting to fall. A moment of absolute pathetic desperation occurred shortly after the judge adjourned the session when Clarissa managed to send a final private message through the legal portal. She bypassed the formal channels to beg Mom for a massive financial loan to pay for Jeffrey's legal defense and the rising cost of his bail bonds. Clarissa claimed that she was still family and argued that Mom had a moral obligation to help her eldest daughter during this unprecedented crisis. She even had the audacity to suggest that the sale of the Boston house should be considered a temporary loan that could be settled once Jeffrey cleared his name. It was the ultimate display of her delusion because she still believed that she could manipulate the very woman she had attempted to destroy through chemical sedation. Mom simply looked at the message on the tablet screen and handed it to me with a faint, weary smile that signaled the end of her internal conflict. I did not hesitate for a single second as I navigated through the settings of every device and social media platform to permanently block Clarissa's access to our lives. I worked with Mr. Henderson to officially change Mom's permanent residency to the state of Montana to ensure that the Boston courts would no longer have jurisdiction over her future welfare. We spent the afternoon burning the final remnants of the letters and the fraudulent documents that had once held us captive in a cycle of fear. I told Mom that we were never going back to that city because our history there had been replaced by the vast, honest openness of the Western Plains. There was no more room for negotiation or forgiveness because the bridge between us and the life we left behind had been burned to the ground by their own actions. The final rays of the afternoon sun were casting long golden shadows across the ranch as Mom and I walked together toward the edge of the sprawling meadow. She moved with a steady grace that required no assistance because her spirit was finally unburdened by the weight of her eldest daughter's betrayal. We stood on a small ridge overlooking the valley where the air was cold and filled with the promise of a quiet, uninterrupted winter. I looked at Mom and realized that we had achieved the impossible by surviving a betrayal that would have broken most families beyond repair. There was no more darkness of greed or the synthetic fog of medication to cloud our vision of the future that lay ahead of us. We turned our backs on the distant memories of the hospital corridors and the cold streets of Boston to embrace the peace of the Montana wilderness. As we walked toward the horizon, I knew that the legacy we were building here would be one of honesty, resilience, and a love that no amount of money could ever buy.